the Catacombic Machine. I'm Josef. This is the final episode of the season. Summer is here and I'm gonna take a little break, but I'll be back with new podcasts maybe in September. Let's say September. And I already have a few good ones lined up, so I will pick up where I left off because this one is a killer, let me tell you. DeLay. He is, of course, an old friend of the podcast. He's been on Then Freestyle Christianity talking about his book, God is Unconscious. And he was also on an episode, I think it was called Lacanian Smorgasbord or something like that. Anyway, most of you know who Tad is, and he's written a new book. It's called The Cynic and the Fool, the Unconscious in Theology and Politics. And you can buy it today. It's out. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to Jonathan Bekkeli for providing the music for this season. You're listening to it right now. Jonathan Bekkeli, you can find him on Spotify. And, of course, this weekend, you can find him in the forest interface. Yes, we're going to the forest for a microburn in Sweden. Jonathan and I and a number of other people who's been on the podcast this season and also previous years. It's going to be amazing. The forest interface. I think you can't buy tickets any longer, but if you really want to go, I still think that you can convince Jonathan that you can buy a ticket. So, find him on Facebook. And I'm excited about that. Finally, before we get going, if you feel sad that there will be no more podcasts coming out during the summer, there's a way around that. You can join Patreon and access whatever I do during the summer. It's not going to be much, but there's going to be some stuff coming out there. So join my Patreon at patreon.com/the Catacombic Machine. Now, this is DeLay from Denver, Colorado, talking about his book, The Cynic and the Fool. Enjoy.
Okay, so welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I am glad to be here. This is my first interview since the book was released, so this is the first time I'm talking about it.
And it's out just the other week.
Yeah, it just came out a few days ago on the publisher's site. It just went online on all the online booksellers yesterday, so I'm tremendously excited to see it out there finally. It's been a long time coming.
I've seen on Facebook that you've been sort of hinting about stuff and maybe even fishing for some comments.
Yeah.
So I've been looking forward to reading it too. And I must say, now I've read it and I think it's a really interesting book. I was thinking we can start talking about who is it for.
Okay.
Because it's references to Lacan and Deleuze and Freud and all these thinkers that are quite complex, but you haven't written it for only people who have read Lacan. You've written it for a much more popular audience, so maybe you can walk us through how you were thinking, because I've even seen you've been writing about that on your Facebook page.
Yeah, it's so important. I really think that as a religious studies scholar especially, and then I feel this way partly about philosophy too, but especially with religious studies, I don't feel like there's very much importance to what we do if it can't be translated to people who don't have unlimited time to read this material. So in 2015, I published this book, God is Unconscious. I had spent a better part of a year researching for that book, reading through everything Lacan ever wrote, and then I was writing it during a very traumatic time in my life, and that book was exactly what I needed it to be at the time. And it was sort of kind of in between like a popular level and an academic. Like it didn't follow a lot of the normal academic conventions, but it was a way for me to, through the language of psychoanalysis and philosophy and theology, it was a way for me to sort of process who I was. So the book God is Unconscious was exactly what I wanted it to be. But then after I released it, my suspicions were confirmed that it was a bit too difficult for most of the people who were exposed to it, and that might just be because of the networks that it was advertised in. But I had so many people that I mean, I felt completely flattered that people would give any attention at all to my work. But I kept running into people who would say, like, I feel like there's an idea here that I'm getting into a little bit, but I'm not quite there. I don't quite understand. Help me understand this. So I kept hearing that over and over. At the same time, I was getting ready to start teaching and start to think through, okay, like what is good pedagogy? Like usually PhDs are terrible teachers. Usually the way they write books are not designed to communicate ideas very well. So I thought, what if I could try again? What if I could take the same ideas, put them at a more accessible level, also import all the stuff that I'm starting to work on for my dissertation. So take a lot more new material, but mix it with the old material, bring in more stories, make it more personal. And I just kind of decided, I guess, at some point that I really want my life's work to be on at least 2 tracks. Like I am interested in contributing new material to the academic discourse, but I don't actually think any of this matters very much, especially not in religious studies. In theology, if I can't communicate it to someone who might be one of my students. Yeah, so that was kind of the motive. So 3 months after I finished God is Unconscious, in May of 2015, I sat down and I said, all right, like I'm going to redo this. So in about 4 weeks, I drafted a new book that is now this. And then I ordered it around this the book is called The Cynic and the Fool: The Unconscious in Theology and Politics, and it's a riff on an idea from Lacan that maybe we can get to. But basically, I was kind of thinking, okay, well, one way to get at the dynamics of collective belief is to think about this question of when someone tells you that something that cannot possibly be true, you have a very quick interpretative direction that you have to make based on whether you think that person is a fool that honestly believes themselves or is sort of this cynical, nihilist, manipulative, knave character who knows exactly what the truth is and is using this material to using you as a means to an end, right? So cynic or fool, cynic or fool. I feel like that's all around us, and I wanted to use that to talk about theology, but really theology is an avenue for me for talking about politics and our collective life, our culture. Oddly enough, I finished that rough draft, I kid you not, one day before Donald Trump declared his candidacy. And even then, like I didn't take it too seriously. I'm still not convinced that he was even trying to win. Right. But now that he has, I feel like every single day, every article that I read in the political sphere has this question: is this person an idiot, or is there something more calculating going on, right? And this seems to be a very live question in our culture right now.
Yeah, so let's go to the cynic and the fool so that we define it from the get-go so that people can follow, because it's not just being cynical or being foolish. You have more to it.
Yeah. Maybe a way to say it was, when I'm using the word fool, I mean, there's an element of like simplicity, but to the concept of foolishness. But I'm also thinking more in like when you say that someone is a fool for believing something, you're saying that specifically because that is the person that genuinely wants to believe what they've heard, right? They don't want to think about there's multiple different tiers that are going on here, multiple different mixed interests, right? If somebody hears something and just believes it immediately, then what they're doing is taking it at face value, right? And I'm actually on that side. Like I want to live in a world where we can all have that kind of honest discourse, but we don't live in that world. We have this second character of, I mean, so the word cynic can, usually when people say cynic, they mean like skeptical, doubting the motives of others, right? And so that's one definition of it. But there is this other way that it gets used in English, where it is somebody who perhaps because they doubt the motives of others or doubts the social norms, they get to a point where words and causes and anything they're involved in is just a means to an end. So like when we call a politician cynical, we're usually not talking about that politician being a very perceptive, skeptical person. Usually when we call a politician cynical, we're talking about they don't care who they hurt, right? They don't care about anything that they're saying except as a means to an end, right? Which is not an end that is good for everyone, right? It's an end that is primarily good for themselves and then perhaps for their constituents as well. So I'm talking about cynicism in more in the way that I used it because it's a more familiar term than knave, which is the term Lacan uses. So like this, I mean, so again, this comes from something that Lacan says in the 7th seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, and it's a really small. It's just a few pages long that he kind of riffs, but he kind of breaks down the way that he thinks politics works, where he kind of says, all right, so you have this foolish desire on the left, not like a stupid desire, but like a foolish, like, the world can and will get better, right? And we're always in a position of provoking the master, more access to healthcare, rights for minorities, these types of things, right? There's this belief that the world can and will get better, but that can sort of have an idealism attached to it that prevents you from thinking through like the hard policy questions, perhaps, right? So that's not a bad thing, but that's sort of his way. Is like the left when Bernie Sanders calls for access to universal health care, you don't have to think what concealed interest is he hiding behind that, right? Like there's a genuineness to it, right? And then Lacan also has this example where he says, but if you imagine like the right wing intellectual on the other hand is the one that admits that he's a crook. And he's the one that when you like challenge him, do you really believe like that immigrants are the source of all our society's ills? Do you really believe that the business world, that our economy would just improve if we just cut everyone's taxes and forced austerity on everyone else? Lacan says the right winger is the one that like when the reporters are gone, when you're pulling up and just having a drink at the hotel bar after the big ridiculous campaign stump speech, the right winger is the one that says, don't insult my intelligence. Like of course I don't believe this, right? Like I'm doing what I'm paid to do. I'm giving the people what they want, right? Don't insult my intelligence by pretending I believe what I'm saying, right? So I'm talking about the cynic and the fool in no sense, and there are dangers to it, right? Like anytime we're trying to get into someone else's head, what do they actually believe? How much of this is something that is genuine to them versus something that's just a conniving mixed interest and so forth. Anytime you do that, there's this danger of psychologizing somebody, of coming up with a wrong interpretation, and that's definitely there, right? Like that's a real danger that we have to think about. But I actually think that it's even more cynical. It's the worst form of nihilism if we don't see what is plainly in front of us. If people are being hurt and we need not pretend otherwise, like there are mixed interests that we're dealing with these days, and we don't need to pretend otherwise. And I think it's actually the worst form of nihilism to refuse to try to get into people's heads every now and then and wonder what other kind of interests they're working for. Does that make sense?
You write that in your book, that you don't need to question someone like Bernie Sanders for his motives. When I read that, I thought that this is an American speaking or writing, because of course having that understanding about the left takes away a number of dictators the past 100 years who were leftist. You can definitely ask the question whether Stalin had other motives than making the world a better place,
right?
Or Mao, or there's a number of them.
Yeah, and those are excellent counterexamples, right? And liberalism in general likes to think of itself as very smart and can't get duped. And the left, like the actual left, we don't have a left wing party in the United States, but like to the extent that there is that actual left, like they also like to think of themselves as like beyond being duped, right? And then so you have like sort of a right wing that wants to be duped, and then a left wing that has this like desire that is occasionally duped as well, right? So a recent poll came out in the U.S. that said more than half of Democrats believe that that Russia actually changed our vote tallies, right? Which is not an accusation that anyone is making, but nevertheless, like 1 and 2 Democrats, right, like believe this sort of. So I mean, so it definitely plays in both ways, right?
There's conversations going on a lot in America, but also in Sweden about social justice, and I don't think that it's a rule, but I do think that social justice can be a career.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You can jump in and make these demands on society to change and become a hero and popular and make money and sell books.
Mm-hmm.
I get that you want to play the binary in order to move forward. But when I read it, that was a question that popped up in my mind. Or, I've been quite skeptical towards the left as well, because I think that the far left and the far right feeds off each other.
Uh-huh.
This is a game we're playing, and I think that a book like yours should make us think about how to move beyond that binary. You talk about Deleuze sometimes in your book.
Yeah, I use him very sparingly, but he's there, but he's pretty spared. Yeah.
He says somewhere, that we're using a dualism in order to challenge another, not to establish a dualism, but to move beyond it. So that was something that I was thinking about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, so every dualism is gonna break down in some sense, right? Like you presented just now terrific counterexamples to what I'm saying, right? And so those counterexamples are there. Yeah, I mean, anytime you have a choice between two, there's a really good chance that that something more is being concealed there, right? So I don't. I mean, maybe another way to say it. I mean, Deleuze has this quote that I like. I think he's quoting. This is an anti-Oedipus. I think he's quoting Spinoza actually, but where he says the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still, why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? Right. I love that. And this is something I say, I think, on like maybe page 2 of my book, where I start to say, okay, and I got this idea from Todd McGowan, who's a psychoanalytic theorist here in the U.S. We have to get beyond thinking that we are subjects who desire to know, right? We're not going to be presented with the full range of information out there and suddenly enlighten ourselves and choose better policy options, right? We're not going to suddenly enlighten ourselves out of religion because we're not subjects who desire to know. We are subjects who desire, full stop, right? Somebody...
You even go into the desiring machine.
Yeah, right? Like, it eats, it breathes, it heats, right?
It shits and fucks, but you leave that out.
Yeah,
it's okay on the podcast. You don't need to write it in.
Yes, yes. The id desires to do a lot of things, right? Freud said this long ago. When it comes to the ego controlling the id, it's like a weak rider trying to control a much more powerful horse, right? That's his analogy that he uses, and I like that because. I do like the idea that our rational cognition is sort of getting dragged along by the brute force of desire, right? And so we live. I mean, so you talk about like the left enjoying the right and working off each other, right? Like the liberals, especially, and then also to some extent the left here in America is really enjoying fighting against Trump, right? Like the hashtag resistance, and then the right is really enjoying seeing liberals on the left fret, right? So there's all this enjoyment going on, and I mean, I come from I grew up in the Bible Belt. Like most of the people I know and love are very on board with everything that's happening right now, and there is this. There are those that seem to display a sense of shame and have kind of shut down from political discourse, but I see just as many that seem to be really excited. I mean, I have a relative, for example, who has late stage cancer and is really excited about cuts to Medicare that will deprive him of healthcare, right? And there's no terror in there. There's like, if this is what it takes to ruin something that Obama has done, then that is worth it. It is worth risking your life and possibly dying for. And I see, sort of that same kind of reactionaryism coming from the other side of things, right? It doesn't matter if our analysis is really poor. It doesn't matter if we're throwing accusations up against the wall that don't stick. It doesn't matter as long as we're expressing ourselves, we're getting that jouissance just purely from the frantic activity of not getting what we want, right? Because we're subjects who desire, not subjects who desire to know.
I think it's a collective thing too, because this binary game that you're playing in America today has given people a clear sense of belonging. Whether you're for Trump or against Trump, you're on the Trump train and Trump, 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 let's make America great again. And on the other side, it's like, you're not my president. We're going to fight him and we're going to impeach him and we're going to protest on the street with pussy hats on. And just after the inauguration, the sort of joyous spirit of the left felt almost as if they had won. In that coming together meant so much. Yes, we can do this together. My question after that happened, with the Women's March and all that happened in Washington, I was thinking, for the first time in I don't know how long, I hear people on the left actually agreeing with one another about anything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that so much of what's going on is, I don't talk about shame a whole lot in the book, but that's become sort of a more recent interest, I think, as I kind of look forward to writing my third book. But I read a lot about anxiety, and I think that a lot of what we're seeing is what anxiety and shame look like at a political level, right? One of the most effective and least healthy ways to deal with shame is just to hate something else just a little bit more, right? And that works, right? Anxiety for Lacan is always this question of, what does the other want out of me? Like, what does the other want me to? What can I do for the other? What does the other want me to do? What is the other asking of me? So anxiety is the sense of like, I know I'm supposed to be doing something, but I don't quite know what, right? And out of that comes the symptom. Out of that comes the repetition. So I think that one of the projects that I'm working on here in Denver with Carl Raschke, a group of us are trying to pull together forums and informal courses and seminars and workshops, trying to get academics in conversation with artists and activists and anyone else who wants to be part of this dialogue, because we do have this sense that there's something more going on than something that we just need to hashtag resistance and vote for more Democrats, right? But the problem is partly Trump, but there's a broader there's something else going on that can't be located at the level of a particular president or administration, right? We're in this. In America in particular, we're kind of in this condition where, like, we're probably not going to break out in civil war, but if we did, it wouldn't be that surprising, right? It is.
I've said on another podcast actually that I think that you will have a civil war.
Okay. Well,
not tomorrow, but looking ahead a little bit, seeing how power is moving out towards the coasts and sort of leaving the middle of America poor and without no jobs and no power. So you have Silicon Valley in the west and you have Washington in the east. It's I don't think it's so much about agreeing with the policies of gay marriage or something. I think it's much more about feeling a sense of belonging in the nation, of feeling that we are contributing and we're also receiving the benefits of our efforts. When you end up in a position where you don't have that, I think that's the heart of the problem, rather than people being bigots and refuses to ever change anything about how they think about any political questions.
Yeah, I mean that's making me think of. So one of the things that I riff on in the book is the story of Job. For those who don't know the story, the gist is that this wealthy, happy man with lots of possessions, lots of family, in a single day, God strikes a bet with the devil, who Job never finds out about this, but right, in a single day, all of his possessions and all of his children are taken away and killed off. So this man loses everything in a day, and then he has three friends and eventually a fourth come and try to present reasons for why he's suffering, right? And these three reasons are still with us today. They basically all boil down to Job, God is punishing you. You've clearly done something wrong. Now you're getting what you deserve. And then secondly, There's this sense of Job, God is not punishing you, but he's giving you an opportunity to learn something. And then thirdly, there's this explanation of actually, Job, let's just deny that you're suffering altogether because other people have it worse. The starving children would trade places with you. All right. So you have these three explanations. You're being punished. B, you are being given a chance to improve yourself. And then third, don't complain because others have it worse. I mean, I think it's interesting because not only are these still with us, and these are all called into question, right? Like the whole point of the book of Job is that none of these work, right? God comes back at the end, and even God doesn't have an explanation. Like it all just sort of breaks down, right? So it's kind of a protest against these explanations. But I do think that they appear in neoliberal capitalism, especially, right? Like the first becomes you are poor because you did not work hard enough. You should have made better life decisions, right? The second becomes, all right, you were poor, but like think how much better it could be if you would just retool your life for a new emerging industry or something like that, right? And then there's definitely this third that's most pervasive is don't complain because for you might think you're part of the 99%, but for a lot of the world you're the 1%, right? So don't complain about your suffering whatsoever. And these three, like any one of those explanations would work on its own, right? So it might not be true, but it would at least be somewhat consistent to kind of latch on to one of those. But anytime you get this kind of scattershot of explanations for why people suffer, you're encountering a system that does not want to address that, right? We don't have the ability to see through these scattershot of explanations of why are people suffering, why are the classic question, and this always struck me as a bit pedantic that liberals would ask this, but like why? But there's an element of truth to it, right? Why do poor white people vote against their own interest, right? And now we're seeing also the sense of like not just against financial interest, but voting against healthcare, right? And voting against having options to go to school. Why do we enjoy that kind of thing? And I think part of it is this discourse of we just have, we can't decide whether to blame people for their circumstances or to tell them that they have an opportunity to change their circumstances, or to say that you're not suffering at all. We don't want to, we don't need to hear about your suffering. Like you've got it better than a lot of other people. So just don't complain whatsoever. Right. And so we're in a position where we're kind of oscillating between all of these explanations that kind of we see in the book of Job and are kind of coming back with a vengeance to justify neoliberal capitalism. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
So you're saying that we're desiring machines and we don't desire to know. There is other things moving us to why we believe what we believe. So why do we believe what we believe?
That's a good question. I think that I'm trying to think through when you get to the level of belief. People often ask me sort of the reverse of that question of why, like, at what point do we change ideas? And so my wager is that we change ideas when we no longer wish to believe in whatever we believe. Like when we lose the active desire to be deceived, we begin to change our opinion. And that often comes unexpected, right? Like somebody says something you weren't expecting. You hear a joke or read a book or hear a song, something that short circuits the normal pathways by which you keep believing what you believe, right? I'm not sure that there's a really simple or good explanation to why we in particular believe the things that we believe, but I do think that a great deal of it comes down to anxiety again, right? For Lacan, indeterminateness, ambiguity, ambivalence. These are postures, I guess you could say, that we deploy in order to not rethink something. And anytime you're seeing somebody be ambivalent about an idea or indeterminate, ambiguous about what they think, you're dealing with there's anxiety beneath the surface, and then that anxiety is putting pressure upon the subject to rethink what they're thinking, right? So a way to double down on what you already think is to become much more ambiguous. Hey, why do you believe what you believe? Well, the person says, well, I don't really know. It just kind of seems like I just rather not do all that rethinking or whatever. Like anytime you encounter that, you're encountering anxiety, right? Somebody kind of knows that their ideas don't work. but is latching onto that idea because that is the mooring line, right? So one of the things Lacan talks about in his 10th seminar on anxiety is that anxiety is the sense that like the mooring lines keeping you in place are being cut, right? And so you'll latch on to anything, right? And I think that belief kind of works that way, right? I'm not so skeptical as to say that there's no rational component to it, right? I don't think there would be much use in writing a book if I didn't believe that we can reason ourselves to some extent out of ideas. But I do think that anytime we're dealing with ideas, where it has a lot more to do with anxiety and keeping sort of a center of something that you can know, something that feels secure, which has nothing to do with whether or not those ideas are true or not. Right, it's all about keeping anxiety in check, which is what Tillich says rituals do. Right, like Tillich says, anytime you're dealing with a religious ritual or a belief, what it's doing is it's channeling anxiety and it's doing something useful with it. And the same ritual can do multiple different things, even if everyone in the room is participating in the same ritual, right? If you have, if you were just bored with your life, or if you're having marriage troubles, or if you are a single parent just getting kicked out of your apartment, that you can come and partake in the Eucharist, and that's a way to sort of channel a certain level of anxiety that gives some sort of sense of relief, perhaps, right? So this, I mean, that's at least that's kind of how Tillich puts it, right? The same crucifix means very different things depending on the circumstances of your life that day when you gaze upon the crucifix, right? So I think that's what religion is. That's what a lot of politics is. That's what all of our beliefs are, right? Like they're all tied at some level to the sense of anxiety or shame, these sort of more primal affects that we're trying to curtail the influence of, mitigate the affective state of by engaging in these beliefs or engaging with these rituals.
When I read the book, I thought about a thing that Henri Bergson said. For the human mind is so constructed that it cannot begin to understand the new until it has done everything in its power to relate it to the old.
Yeah, I like that.
And in your book, you write, just as the body desires homeostasis, the mind prefers the territory it already knows. We wouldn't admit it, but given the choice between anxious uncertainty and wrong-headed certainty, we'd prefer to stick with the false ideas we already believe. This is because we're human.
Right.
And so there's something tying together the Bergsonian notion about how our minds are biologically, how they function. Mm-hmm. And of course, you could go into Deleuze there as well, because he riffs on the Bergsonian notion. But you also say that the beliefs that we hold and the reasons for those beliefs, those are not the reasons for why we believe. The reasonings for why we believe, they're not actually why we believe. We desire things, and the reasonings that we want to believe are our own reason to believe, are actually rationalizations of what we're moved towards, what we desire.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, for one, it's such a simple example, but when I am teaching students, I mean, so far I mainly teach, I teach religion and philosophy, but when I'm teaching an intro to Christianity course, my students who know the Bible best they struggle the most with it, right? Because when you're going through the history of beliefs, and we can say sometimes down to the century, sometimes down to the year when a particular belief emerges onto the map, that can feel threatening to people, right? And so what I often encounter is that students will like really resist the idea that a particular belief has a history, that it comes into being at a certain time and place under certain religious, political, economic conditions for certain reasons, and that reasoning changes over time. I'll find students like will push back again. I mean, so to use the most dullest example, I guess, is when I have students that really need Genesis 1 and 2 to be the same story that actually happens, right? So like not only do they happen, but they're not two separate creation myths written 1,000 years apart. They are part of the same story, and one is just zooming in on the other. I know that student is defending that belief for reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not that belief actually matters in their day-to-day life, right? They're actually defending that belief because It's a tertiary belief defending a secondary belief, defending a primary belief, right? Like well, if I can't trust Genesis, then I can't trust the Bible. If I can't trust the Bible, I can't trust God, and then there's no afterlife or no purpose in life, right? Like, so it's whether or not Genesis 1 and 2 are the same myth or not should not elicit any sort of anxiety any more than any other sort of contradiction in the Bible. But for some reason, that matters a lot, right? And it has nothing to do with the thing that we're actually debating, right? And we forget this a lot when we're talking about when we're trying to rationalize ourselves into better ideas. People hold on to ideas not because that idea is actually important to them, but because it's guarding a belief that is guarding another belief that is guarding another belief that is super important to them. And so my wager is that, again, as the body desires homeostasis, the mind desires an epistemic stasis, and it will keep thinking the same thing, not because it needs that idea to be true, but because once you lose that idea, it cascades, right? And you lose other things, right? So it's easier just to keep everything in place, become very ambiguous, say that it's a mystery you don't know, and keep everything sort of in place against resistance. Yeah. So that, there's all sorts of, how do you approach that as an educator? What's the ethical route to go there? What's good pedagogy? Right, there's a lot of questions. It's not at all clear how to deal with that. But you're definitely not dealing at the level of the rational at that point. You're dealing at the level of anxiety and affect.
How do you think then about your own ideas today?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have this understanding that we believe things and we rationalize in order to defend our beliefs, but deep down there's desires. But that's true also for what you believe today.
Yeah, sure.
Could it be possible to sort of short circuit that and end up, at least we know this, and that moves us at least up a level where we can rationalize in a different manner?
Yeah, I'm not to the absolute point of skepticism where I say that, we're not rationalizing ourselves out of anything at all ever. But I do think that there's, this is kind of like basic death of the author, right? Like the author itself, like, does not know why he or she wrote everything that they wrote, right? There's always sort of mixed motives. And I even talked about, like, with God as Unconscious, for example, my first book, like I was reading it out of this kind of traumatic moment while I was reading a theory of trauma, right? And I sort of wrote myself into that text as I processed a little bit of who I am. But anytime you write, especially a book about psychoanalysis, right, you're writing more about yourself than you mean to. But any author does that, right? I would be delusional if I thought that I understand every little motive for every little thing that I wrote. I still kind of, even this book that just published yesterday, right? I still look back and I kind of think, I'm not completely sure like why I felt like that particular example was so important, but I kind of have a suspicion, and I'm not sure that I like why I think I might have thought that example was so important. So that affects we have this. Every student wants to think that their professor knows something. If the student indeed wants to learn something, every person that reads a book wants to think that the author has something to contribute, right? And the scary thing is like the subject's supposed to know doesn't know themselves fully either, right? Like we don't know the answers either. There's a lot of me that I've written into this book that can't be just reduced to the level of I've carefully thought through an idea, right? Like there are all sorts of passions and unconscious ideas, right? Like when you write a book, you're writing your own repression into a text.
Yeah. But because for me, I'm thinking our understanding about how reasoning is, what is it for?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes when we speak about truth, people want to speak about truth in a representational manner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I've talked quite a lot about on the podcast.
Uh-huh.
But to move beyond, when I say short circuit, I'm not sure that's the best word, but I would say at least, come to another understanding about what we're actually doing when we're thinking, when we're reasoning, and to move beyond a representational logic where the aim is to represent the world as good as we can because there is this perfect way to do it. That's the basic assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should give up on that and move on to a place where we're not trying to represent the world, but we're creating ways to interact in the world. And that's also how we can create new ways to to build the world together. And so we can imagine the world in different ways.
I think that's great. And I've heard you discuss that on your podcast before, actually, like the different concepts of truth. And I thought you've done an actually marvelous job, because that's kind of a hard subject to tackle, but I've heard you do it like very well. I mean, that makes me think of Heidegger talks about Van Gogh painting a picture of a peasant's shoes over and over and over again, right? And what is he doing, right? Van Gogh is not accurately representing what a shoe looks like. That's not his goal, right? He's trying to talk about the beyond. That's what art does, right? It talks about a beyond. It presents a picture. So when you paint a peasant's shoes, what you're doing is you're talking about, you're trying to evoke, okay, what does this worn out shoe say about the harsh life that this peasant lived in? Like, what dreams did she not get to fulfill? What sort of abuse did she suffer in this condition? And he says the same thing about poetry, right? Poetry, Heidegger says, is it's like projective saying, right? We need to cast a vision for, okay, like there's truth and facts and blah blah blah, but poetry is a projective saying, and I think that we need that in terms of theology and politics too, right? We need to cast a picture of what a better world could be. And then on the darker side of that, the apocalyptic image of how bad things could get if we don't do something better. I think that that's important too, right? Like, I think kind of the picture of the monster is actually kind of important for the human psyche to organize around in a negative way. But I don't think that it doesn't have the same generative power as projecting a better future, a better truth.
So in the book, you write about Freud and how we defend our beliefs, and Freud gives 3 reasons or 3 ways that we are defending our beliefs. The number one is that our tribe has always believed this one thing that we're trying to defend. So, if someone says, well, the theory of evolution, I mean, this is something important in America for some reason, the theory of evolution. And then, no, in our tribe, we have always believed that God created the heavens and the earth. That's number one. Number 2 is evidence. Mm-hmm. And so you try to come up with, on that particular issue, no, it's the flood that created the illusion that the earth is much older. And so you get these layers. And so there are evidence for our beliefs. And the third one is you're not allowed to ask that question. Mm-hmm. That's when you get too close.
Right.
You have a personal story in your book about when you learned about the prohibition against asking questions. So maybe we can go there and make it personal.
Yeah, I mean, I have several stories, I think, from this one character who was a friend and a pastor of mine for some time, and to this day is still he's stayed true to the faith. But he was very instrumental in helping me kind of hold up a mirror to what I believed. So in Freud in Future of Illusion talks about this all right, 3 reasons, and Freud's view of this, in my view, is a little bit too simplistic. But we either have always believed this, or we have the proofs, the rational argument for our beliefs, or it's just prohibited to ask questions. And this one character, this pastor of mine, would just hold up a mirror. So, I mean, for one example, he at one point, I'm trying to think like which story to go. At one point, I remember finding out that the Bible had between 0 and 23 uses of the word hell, depending on translation, and that none of the words Tartarus, Gehenna, or Hades actually translates as that. And I remember asking him one time, and this was just when I was just edging out of my very conservative fundamentalism that I was raised with. So I was probably 19 or so at the time, and it took a long time to get rid of that. I asked him, why have I never heard this before, right? Like, why, if every seminary trained person knows that this idea is very problematic and it has a history to it, why have I never heard this in my whole life? Why did I just have to stumble across it in a book somewhere? And he would tell me, Tad, you should be beyond asking that question. Not beyond in the sense of this shouldn't matter to you, but beyond as in you should not ask that question. You're prohibited from asking that question, right? And I remember asking a similar question, why doesn't our church do much to feed the poor, right? And he said at some point, well, you think about it this way, like if you have $1, you can use it to fund missionaries or you can feed a starving child. And quite honestly, at the end of the day, it sounds terrible, yes, but at the end of the day, that child burning in hell for all eternity is not as bad as that child starving to death today. And I was kind of, I was always kind of amazed at the consistency that he was able to articulate. They experienced no cognitive dissonance at the types of horrible things that he would say. And it was so helpful. I so appreciated that because in a sense, he's right, actually, right? Like, inside that belief framework, he's right. And so that again allowed me to kind of hold up a mirror and say, okay, well, this belief doesn't quite work for me anymore. Like if we're gonna have to justify starving children, but it was all kind of based around this whole: you're prohibited from asking that question. Just trust it, right? Keep the mooring lines in place, right? Don't abandon them, because there's all sorts of catastrophes that are going to cascade out of control after that. So you're gonna lose everything. And I think that he was right, right? Like I mean, I did end up losing all those beliefs. So that I think that's true. I think where I don't like Freud as much is that Freud kind of thinks that all religion is based on a wish. I think there's definitely an element of truth to that, but my sense is that I encounter people who believe all sorts of things that they genuinely seem to not want to believe and not derive any perceivable pleasure from all the time. That they believe because, again, this is what my tribe believes, and if I lose it, so I mean, you could say it's based on a wish, on like a secondary wish, right? But it's not like I wish for this to be true. It's like if I lose this idea, then I have to leave. I'm going to be ostracized, right?
And so you write in the book, because your pastor friend, he ended up in some trouble. So just to give sort of an entry point to that, you write that, odd as it may sound, there is a sense in which a fundamentalist worldview sees progressive beliefs as worse than criminally abusive behavior.
And this is a separate guy. So I've known quite a few. I've probably had like a larger than normal run-in with awful people. But so this is a different guy than I was talking about before. So yeah, in 2008-9, I was a pastor at a church in the American South, and it was a small upstart. It wasn't for very long, but I had been excited about this community because we'd sort of prided ourselves on being kind of more open to different beliefs that are not well represented in Arkansas. So I had been excited to be part of this, and I was going through a lot of changes in how I viewed things at the time as well. And I kind of one day casually mentioned to my head pastor that my inherited very bigoted views about gay people were definitely changing, right? And I wasn't quite sure where I was going, but I was like, yeah, I mean, this whole like anti-gay ideology just doesn't work for me anymore. Like there's too many problems with this. So and my mind is kind of in flux on this. And at the moment of this meeting, I wasn't like a martyr about it. So it wasn't like something that I even put a lot of thought into beforehand. It wasn't something I expected to be any big deal whatsoever. So I say that to say this was not a brave decision on my part. This was just part of like a casual conversation. And the next day, he calls me up and says we need to meet again, and so we do. And he tells me that my services are no longer needed, and that there must be something deeply wrong with me. I don't quite put out the whole story in the book, but it was much more personal and vociferous than what I portray in the book. And in that culture where like if you are not like sort of staying true to the childlike faith that you once had, that very quickly becomes personal accusations, right? So I had a number of friends in that community who were very, very supportive, but I also watched like friends that I had since middle school really enthusiastically support this guy for getting rid of me. And I sat in that space for 9 months, not able to figure out what was wrong with me. That's like why my beliefs were so terrible. But being very sure, like because of that very honed Christian superego, I was very sure that I must be in the wrong, but I couldn't figure out how. And so 9 months later, he was arrested for having sex with an underage boy, and this pastor who had terminated me. arrested, and it was one of the weirdest days in my life. I felt, such horror for the kid. I felt terrible for the pastor's family. I felt bad for the community that I had once led. And I also at the same time felt like I needed to keep those separate. Those have nothing to do with each other, right? When already it was immediately apparent that I had actually not been fired for changing beliefs about gay people. I'd been fired just to kind of for him to appear a more safely conservative, traditional family man, right? So it was part of the cover, I guess. And I went to seminary. I decided to go to seminary and go the academic routes and do a PhD eventually, between those two events, between my firing and his arrest. But so I entered seminary with this story in the background because one of the things that really taught me was that a lot of people in that community, I thought that I would get my friends back, right? I thought that, surely people would say, hey, we made like a really bad call and sorry about that, or perhaps say nothing whatsoever and just let it go, right? But what actually happened was that a number of people in that community became far more hostile towards me afterwards. And so that's where this idea comes from, that I write about, where I think, especially in that sort of Southern fundamentalist culture, someone who has progressive beliefs looks like they are making a conscious decision to rebel against God, right? And somebody who is criminally abusive has made a temporary moral failing from which we need to pray them back, right? So I mean, it's a very and that is these are fairly well educated middle class people. Like this is not like a way outside of the mainstream of American society. This particular church that I'm talking about. This is sort of a logic that I think hides inside the beast of organized religion. Is when you make a conscious choice to believe something different, that's actually worse than slipping and just abusively hurting somebody, right? Like this is weird kind of polarity. So I mean, I don't blame the people that gave him support in that situation, that kind of rallied around him and wanted to restore him or whatnot. Um, I think that the people in that church were like really terrific, wonderful people who were caught in the deceit of a con man. Uh, and I watched people who I think have, on the whole, very good moral sensibility, support a pedophile, right? Like, so how does that happen? And that's the lesson that I sort of carried into my seminary studies, where I would be beginning to study psychoanalysis, and that was kind of an entry lesson to me. How do perfectly wonderful, good people who express all sorts of conscious, like very kind, wonderful, generous people, unconsciously, your actual existence can be something completely polar opposite. It can be extremely hostile. It can lead to aggressively awful decisions. That was just a fascinating, horrific, mix of so many emotions that I carried with me as I began to think about how do beliefs shape people. How do we pick what is important and what is not important, and how is it that abuse and criminal behavior can be less important than what someone says about gay people, right? How does that work, right? That's a lesson that I carried with me as I began to study all this. And I think I'm just now. I mean, this is the first time I've ever written about it is in this book, so this is going on 7 years later. It's taken me that long to sort of process it and feel like I can talk about it without getting angry, because it's kind of something that I appreciate as a personal lesson at this point, in a way.
So I remember you wrote about this on your Facebook.
Yeah,
It's a while back now, but I still remember I read it. So
a year or two ago, I first started discussing it publicly, and then now it's in print.
But how was the response on Facebook? Because I imagine, I don't know about you, maybe they all unfriended you, but I still have a lot of friends, even conservative evangelical friends. I have them too. And I'm still friends with them on Facebook. And I can imagine that's not my story, but if it were and I wrote something like that, I would get responses from them as well.
Yeah.
So did you receive any feedback from the people that you were actually talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned it a couple times now on social media, and it has led to further people most of the people that I know from that era have already unfriended me, and a good number of family members as well. it has led to more of that. But I actually did. I mean, this is so in the book I mentioned that not one person from that phase of my life ever apologized. But I did actually. One person did actually see it and reach out and kind of said like I had no idea. I'd never thought about it in these terms. Like that, that's awful. And so like that spoke well of him. Was after the book went to print, so I don't get to put that in the book. But yeah, there has been some very small bit of reconciliation from all that. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's. I mean, a lot of these guys that were involved in that whole situation still pastor churches elsewhere. Some moved out of state. Some kind of like cut ties and ran elsewhere. And then I think that was just easier for them than dealing with the aftermath of that whole situation. And then obviously, also cut ties with me as well. So I mean, a lot of those relationships will never be reconciled, and that's okay. And that's not something I feel like I need very much anymore. I appreciate it more as a lesson at one point in my life. But yeah, it was just a bizarre scenario. It really was. It was the weirdest.
We don't need to go deeper there, but I can say I wasn't surprised at all when I read that,
Mhm.
because I lived in America. I know these people
Uh-huh.
from way back. Anyway, that's that pastor. He's a bad guy, but you also write about saints. Interestingly, I think, and about saints as empty signifiers. So maybe we need to clarify what is an empty signifier and how is that related to our saints. And we don't only talk about ancient saints or Jesus, but we also talk about maybe Mother Teresa or Mandela or
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I mean, and also for uh, so I talk about that, and you're talking, I think, from chapter 4, and then at the ending chapter, I return to Ernesto Laclau, who talks about the empty signifiers being like where populism starts, right? Like it's kind of this empty idea, the people, real Americans, something like that means nothing, right? And then we put meaning into that. I had a story also, and I guess just a few months after the one that I just told, a week or two before I started seminary studies, I flew out to see my best friend who was interning in Washington, D.C. at the time. And I have the story that I think back to every day, every year on Martin Luther King Day, because of what it taught me about how we project visions of somebody onto the visions that are not there. I was visiting this friend in Washington D.C. and they have an old congressional building next to next to the nation's capital on the National Mall. And then they have like a man-made cavern that goes underneath the two buildings so that congressmen can get between their offices and the Capitol where they vote without being disturbed by reporters or traffic or anything like that. So there's this man-made cavern. There's like a tram that runs for people who are too lazy to walk it. And it empties out in the deep underbelly of the state capitol, or the state national capital. And in the bottom of the Capitol, our Supreme Court used to meet in this cold, dark room at the bottom of the Capitol. Now they have their own separate building down the street. But they, for so long, they met at this little tiny dark room in the bottom of the Capitol. And so it was kind of it's an amazing thing to stumble into because I didn't even know that until my friend was showing me around. And right out, and so I'm already thinking about like the swirling mix of good and horrific decisions that were made in that room so long ago. And then right outside there was this statue, and my friend asked me, "So have you ever seen this statue before? Do you know who this is?" And I'm thinking like, "No, I've definitely never seen this one before." And he's like, "Oh no, you've heard of this character before. Like just play back the images, right? Think back to your history books." And I'm just like, "No, I have never seen this figure before. This is someone new." And to be sure, there was the only similarity between that statue and the George Washington in my textbooks was the complete absence of the depiction of all his slaves, right? I mean, like, so my friend explains that this is one of the oldest statues we have of George Washington, and we know that because it looks nothing like any of the rest. So when art historians are trying to pin a date on a depiction, they look at other depictions with dates that we know and then compare it to see how much has changed, and then they sort of quantify.
Yeah, they wouldn't make him uglier and shorter or weaker.
No, yeah. No, well, really. So about 10 years after Washington's death, this is the primordial father for America. About 10 years after his death, they start cutting decades off of his life in pictures. His features are smoothed over. He's always got like sort of an elegant statesman-like pose, always very well dressed. There's almost, even in a lot of our iconography, we have almost like a halo around his head, right? So he's sort of misremembered as this saint that looks nothing like what he actually looked like for the important parts of his career. So I think about that story every year on days where we revere a saint in America, such as Martin Luther King. Right? I see my conservative friends talking about we need to live up to his dream of a colorblind society. I see my liberal friends talking about opposing racism or whatever. I see very few friends talking about a man who believed that giving money to the military was stealing from the poor, right? I see very few friends remembering connections with certain socialist or communist elements, right? I see very few of my liberal friends talking about how the white liberal was even more concerning to him than the Ku Klux Klan, right?
And also you mentioned Zizek brings up that he was killed at the right moment.
Yeah.
Because if he weren't killed at that moment, the FBI would have released the file where he was outed as that he was cheating on his wife.
Right. There was some of that, and I want to be careful about his thing because Zizek kind of, I think, plays. He could be a little more careful with how he phrases that. But I mean, his point is that his growing opposition to the Vietnam War, especially, was something that was about to make him intolerable. Right. It was going to make him reviled as Malcolm X was reviled. Right. And so Malcolm X is not misremembered so much as he is just suppressed from altogether. I don't think I even heard of the character until sometime late in college, right? He's nowhere in conservative American discourse in history. So I entered entered seminary with kind of when I would be studying other kinds of saints, right? With this lesson on how we misremember a saint. A saint is always someone who I look up to and who agrees with everything I already agree with, right? And there's an easy person, even with Martin Luther King. Not a whole lot of historical distance between us today and him. How much more are we projecting onto somebody who lived 1,500 years ago?
I remember when Mandela died, and there was this memorial at a football stadium in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, they were filming all these celebrities, or George Bush was there, I think, with his wife and a lot of other people. And I was thinking, Mandela would probably have hated that half of the people at his funeral were there.
Right.
But everyone was there because suddenly, he was on the terrorist watch list till 96 or something like that in America. But when he died, I don't know, 10 years later, maybe a little bit more, suddenly he's revered as a saint and everything is washed away. And the only thing that's kept is the idea that he believed what we believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so he moves from being this very provocative person to becoming a legitimation for our own values.
Yeah.
Whatever those values are.
Yeah. There's this immediate idealization that goes on, and it's not idealizing their best qualities, right? It's idealizing whatever is your value that you can now project onto them, right? I think that happens all the time. I think that we do the same thing with just at a very basic level with the scriptures, thinking that two writers who lived on different continents in different millennia would have agreed on the same thing, right? There's a personal lesson in that, right? How much do I agree with myself from 1 year ago, right? If I get 10 years down the road and I still agree with everything that I've written in this book, something's wrong, right? But we don't.
You have to be dead.
Yeah, right. Right. Now, some people do that, right? Some people never change their ideas about anything, and that's really tragic, right? But we're always in a process. We never know ourselves. We never completely agree with another person or even ourselves. But somehow we think that some sort of saintly figure, some subject supposed to know, some subject supposed to be justice, right? We have this idea that that person is somebody that's agrees with us, ratifies what we thought. Lacan has this great example that I love, where he talks about the need for the other's ratification. That I love, where he says, what does a child do when an infant first sits in a mirror and reaches that developmental stage where they recognize themselves in the mirror as being themselves rather than another child? He says, like, what does a child do every time? Well, the child like spins around to its caregiver and like tries to see if their mother or father, or, whoever else is, kind of smiling, nodding along, saying, "Yeah, that's you. That's really you, huh?" And he's like, "How interesting is it that from the very first moment of our conscious awakening, the first thing we do is absolutely demand that the other ratify what we're plainly seeing in front of us, right? So that need for the other's ratification of what you believe is already there. That's the first thing you do when the ego awakens, right? I think that's absolutely fascinating for how we think about ourselves in relation to saints or to any sort of idea that seems important to us. That need for ratification is there, and it's in all of us. It's not a matter of self-confidence or narcissism or anything like that. It's there to some extent in everyone, and that's part of being a good neurotic.
I want to end this by asking, throughout the process writing this book, what have you learned that you think that is most important moving forward if you look to our political situation in the Western world, where we have Trump-like figures, but similar situations in many countries? Because to me, I've been saying this a lot on the podcast this year. I've been complaining about the left, about progressives and so on, and it's not because I think they're worse than Trump's people or anything like it. It's just I don't think they are listening. So I talk to the people that I believe are listening, and I want us to sort of question our own methods at times, because when there's brilliant academics are writing "punch a Nazi" on Facebook, I just want to punch my computer because I see in what direction we're moving. Was it last week we had someone who shot a congressman or a lawmaker or something? I didn't see anyone really condone that, but what's the difference? Is that the answer to Trump, to act like that? Or is there another way? Because you write about Nietzsche and you write about slave morality, you write about resentment, and that's a trap for any opposition towards a despot. How do we avoid ending up in that sort of slave morality against Trump?
Yeah, I think that Nietzsche might be the most important person for people to read Genealogy of Morals and to think through resentments turning into, how do you say it? I think ressentiment. That evolution, that enjoyment that you get in the moral superiority is the trap, right? It's productive. It will build a coalition, but it's also a trap. I feel like what I have learned more through finishing this book and then writing my dissertation is just how much I still don't understand about the drive of populism on the left, especially, but also the right. By way of closing this, I should say I also wrote my dissertation on psychoanalysis and populism in conjunction resonances with American religion, and I defended that 6 weeks before our election. Right, so this is my next project is trying to update that and think through what we're seeing right now, and try to have like more academic work to contribute. I think that we have been having this war about morals and decency and facts that is going to get us nowhere. I have had family members unfriend me, cut ties, say horrible things, as well as friends, but even family members, purely for thinking that it's wrong for the president to sexually assault somebody, right? there is an enjoyment in the type of rage going on that is causing people to act in ways that yield more enjoyment. But they have shame and anxiety at the base of them, right? Like, so we have this kind of trifecta of shame and anxiety and jouissance that is spilling into the political scene. And we think that morality and facts and that these are the levels of discourse, right? Like there is a white rage going on. There is like a patriarchal rage going on. There is a progressive rage against that rage that's building off of that rage. And it's all a battle of affects. And, one of the things that Freud and Lacan, any psychoanalyst will tell you is that a direct test of strength against a defense mechanism is a losing battle, right? You always have to route it, right? You have to short circuit. And we're in a battle of affect. We're in a battle of anger and rage and shame and anxiety. And underneath it is people's genuine enjoyment of this battle going on. I guess to answer your question, no, it's more of a sense of how much I still have left to understand. What are the differences between left-wing populism and right-wing populism? When exactly does someone who enjoys being part of a brutal racist or patriarchal movement stop feeling enjoyment at that? When does hashtag fuck Trump get to the point on Facebook where someone says, okay, this is not going to work. Like this is there's nothing actually being passed along that's productive here. I feel like our battle today is one of intellectual awakening. It's one of thinking through how affect is controlling the discourse. It's not a battle of facts. It's not like something that we're going to march for science into an awakening, right?
When you write about us as desiring machines, and we have this intellectual elite on the left treating people's support for Trump as intellectual convictions. So everyone probably on my Facebook or Twitter that I'm now thinking of, they know what you're writing because they read Lacan, they read Deleuze, they read these psychoanalytic thinkers. But they're so moved of affect that they forget about it in the moment and participate in a battle of like-minded people who are just fighting it out. And I don't think anyone believes that's the way to do it. And I get it. Sometimes you just tweet something and then like, fuck, I shouldn't have tweeted that.
No, I do it too. I mean, I get that. And I at the same time, I do feel like there is some value to the apocalyptically awful image that is being projected on that, but it's a very limited value. And it doesn't get you that far, and it does serve to further alienate people who see the world in very different ways. It might build a tiny bit of a coalition with those who already kind of view the world the same way as you. But yeah, I mean, I do that too, and there's enjoyment in that, right? Like, and it's all the same game. It's all the same game of enjoyment that my other friends or family members are enjoying from the very opposite end of that spectrum, right?
But if we take also into consideration what we talked about, people are feeling as if they're left out of society. People are feeling that they cannot take part in the benefits that is produced and so on. And if that's sort of their motivation, I'm not saying that's true for all, but I do think it's true for a lot of people. The best way to convince them, because ultimately it's the people that elected Trump. You got the president that you deserve, not someone else, right? They elected him. And how do you change their minds? By calling them racist and homophobes and just throw that at them? That's not going to change anyone's mind, right?
Yeah, I think about it, I mean, the same way that I think about how far that I still have to go in learning how to be a good teacher, right? Like, what is good pedagogy? Good pedagogy is never like criticizing your student for being an idiot, right? Now, it is okay to say, okay, that view is severely problematic. Let's talk about why. But it's even, I mean, I would so much rather prefer be able to ask a student, why is that idea important to you? Let's talk about that. Who else has something to say about that, right? I would much prefer that, because I know at the end of the day, like if the student says something that I vehemently disagree with, I'm not going to call it out in class. Well, with a very few exceptions on a range of subjects that I will call out, but But I understand that that's not productive. But I also understand that the student has that view for reasons that are not purely rational, and they need to be discussed, and they need to hear from their classmates. So I've had students that said very sexist things before, right? And that's something that I'm willing to put a stop on. But best classes have been when a female student raises their hand and wants to talk about like what she just heard in that dialogue, right? So I mean, I kind of think that maybe if we thought about our political discourse as better pedagogy, maybe those of us in a position to teach at least would have something to contribute at all, right?
That's it, friends. Season's over. I hope that you've enjoyed listening and that you'll come back in September. And for those of you who have joined Patreon, I'll talk to you soon. The rest of you, have a nice summer.